Hello and welcome back to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple of different reasons. The first of which is to take my brain out of the mode of background work over the course of the week and move into the process of writing and preparing a sermon that I will preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason. And the second is just to allow you, the viewer, who have graciously given of your time to come by and listen to me ramble, to gain some different insight into the assigned text for the week. So that is why I do these. Good to be back. If you are a regular viewer, you know I've been kind of absent here the last couple of weeks. Had a vacation here a couple weeks ago, and then last week was actually not slated to preach. Had my synod bishop coming in for a visit to preach, so I did not prepare a sermon that way around either. But we're back at it this week as we look at this particular Sunday, which is February 17th, 2019, the sixth Sunday after Epiphany. And our assigned text this week comes out of Luke chapter 6, verses 17 through 26. Now, just a word on where we're at in terms of the season, especially considering that we're a few weeks farther along than the last video I did. This year, Epiphany goes about as long as it possibly can. If you're familiar with the way the church year works, it's all determined by when Easter falls, and Easter falls and moves depending on the lunar calendar, which is weird, but it does, and that's why Easter is at a different time every year. But so depending on where Easter falls, that shoots forward on the calendar to determine when Lent begins. And Epiphany goes from the same time every year, starting January 6th, and runs until the start of Lent, which kicks off on Ash Wednesday, which is like March 6th this year. So that season, from January 6th until the beginning of Lent, whenever that happens to be, is however long Epiphany is. And this year, the way Easter falls, Easter's not until the 21st of April, which is pretty much as late as it can be. I was actually looking at a thing today, just a few minutes ago, and the latest that I have seen in terms of the whole calendar for as far out as I can determine, I think it's like 2038, so like 19 years from now, it's the 25th of April, which is the latest I have ever heard of. But with it being the 21st of April this year, that week is about as late as it can go. So all that being said, we are getting into some texts here in this little branch here at the end of Epiphany that we normally don't get. Just usually Epiphany doesn't go this long, and so these particular texts are pretty uncommon for us to feature, including this one out of Luke. I happen to look back. This is now my sixth season of Epiphany that I've tracked through since I've been ordained as a pastor, and I have not preached on these texts in this context before. I actually have preached on this in different ones. This particular text does show up at different times in the church year, but in this arrangement or this particular block at this particular time, it's a new one for me. So that's just kind of some side thoughts, some logistical, liturgical, lectionary type of things, which are big fancy words, but anyway, so that's kind of where we're at. One final thought, just kind of a reminder for the season of Epiphany as we continue to look at ways that Jesus is revealed to the world. And that's always important to keep in mind as we look at these texts. Kind of where my thoughts are at right now don't necessarily point that direction, and maybe they should. And as I say this and it comes out of my mouth, I think, be aware of that, Scott. That's something that we should think about. But anywho, let's go ahead and get into the text, and then we'll kind of dive into it some more. So again, Luke chapter 6, verses 17 through 26. Jesus came down with them being the newly appointed 12 disciples or apostles that he has just chosen directly before this. He came down with them and stood on a level place, and a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. They had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. And all in the crowd were trying to touch him, for power came out from him and healed all of them. Then he looked up at his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day, and leap for joy. For surely your reward is great in heaven, for that is what their ancestors did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets. All right, so that's the end of it. So the context of this is known in Luke as the Sermon on the Plain. It is parallel to what Matthew calls the Sermon on the Mount. And much of the topics that go on from this point and then on through the remainder of chapter 6, which is pretty lengthy, are that sermon, and the teachings kind of correspond. Now, Matthew's account is much longer. It actually lasts over the course of 3 chapters in Matthew's gospel, and so things are fleshed out more, and there are aspects that we don't have here in Luke, but what we do have in Luke is pretty much, for the most part, also present in Matthew. So it's definitely a corresponding thing there. Now, the difference in setting is interesting. Again, Matthew's is on the mountain. I use mountain loosely. I was there last spring, not quite a year ago, and here in the U.S., where we have rolling hills in the Midwest, where I am, and then you don't have to drive super far to start to get to the Rocky Mountains and big mountains. This mount that tradition says is the one that Jesus was on is more of a big grassy rolling hill, and it's big, but it's not a big Rocky Mountain as I tend to think of it. But Luke places it on a level place, on the plain, the Sermon on the Plain. And I think the setting is interesting. This is one thing that's kind of caught my attention, is that Jesus is speaking on the same level as everyone else. And maybe that's important to think of, not so much logistically, but like symbolically, that Jesus has come to the same level as we are. It speaks to the divine becoming human, the divine dwelling among us, being one with us. And is there something different about Jesus? Yes, of course. As we hear, everyone wants to touch him because the divine power is coming out of him, healing diseases, casting out demons. All that is happening, and that's important. That's another thing that I picked up on. And yet, Jesus is on the same level as we are, and that we can look God in the face is significant in ways that maybe we can't really even articulate. Now, that being said, that brings me to the next point that kind of has captured my attention, that the first thing that Jesus does is heal and cast out demons. The people come, and it's people from all over the place. We hear they're from Judea and Jerusalem, but they're also from the coastal regions of Tyre and Sidon. This is very likely a mixed group, not just Jewish people, but also Gentiles. So his audience would have a wide variety of backgrounds. And yet they all come to him. They recognize that there's something about him. And the first thing that Jesus does before he begins to teach them is that he heals them. He frees them from that which has apparently physically hindered them, or spiritually in the case of the unclean spirits. But I think that's important to recognize in terms of the gospel as a whole. That's greater. After he does this, then Jesus begins to teach. So there's that sense of following, of discipleship, of learning from Christ. And that's important. That's an important aspect of our life as believers. But the first thing Jesus does for them is free them from what hinders. And I think that there's a parallel for that in terms of how we are first freed from that which hinders us. And that's freed from our brokenness, freed from our sinfulness, the forgiveness of God's grace coming upon us and freeing us from that burden, whether we recognize it or not. That has been given to us even before we become followers of Christ, or before we begin to learn from him. And I think that's important, that God frees us, and then the learning begins. I think that learning, or if we want to call it sanctification, or whatever we want to call it, that's a lifelong thing, from the point where the gospel catches us in the heart until our days on this earth come to a close. I think that's a lifelong process, and yet the freedom comes at the beginning. Stepping off from there, the next thing that I want to really connect with, or that I really think about, is what we call the Beatitudes, the blessed R's. Of course, Matthew has these as well. Matthew has more of them. but Luke has fewer in number, but also adds to them the contradictory woes, the woe to you, and it's very much back and forth. And when I preached on this particular portion before, that's kind of what I've really focused on, that there is this great reversal that's coming about, and that, but I think it also points to a sense of equality, that in the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God, whatever that is, whatever that's going to look like, we will be on equal footing. There will not be the separation of rich and poor and hungry and fulfilled and weeping and laughing and all of these different things. They kind of point different directions, but they raise the point of what do we put our hope in? What do we put our stock in? What do we put our faith in? And I think there's a sense of rebuke in here in these woes that I don't want to hear either. But I think it's important to acknowledge that whereas Matthew's version kind of spiritualizes this a little bit more, like the poor in spirit, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, Luke is a little more on the nose, like blessed are the poor, woe to you who are rich, blessed are those who are hungry, for you will be satisfied, but woe to you who have had your fill now. And I think for us, it was particularly within our rather affluent society, that's important for us to take note of, that those things that perhaps we consider ourselves blessed, or we think that, oh, life's been good to me, or I've worked hard for it, or whatever, that those things are fleeting. And yet, do we put our faith in them? Do we put our stock in them? And if so, we need to hear that sense of rebuke. And that's good to acknowledge. But I want to circle back around to the blesseds. And what I really love about this, what kind of revealed itself to me as I was working through the original language, the Greek, is that word for blessed, which is makarioi, kind of a weird name, but it's in the nominative case. So it's like naming someone blessed. Like you are called blessed. Your identity is blessed. Just like my name is Scott. According to this, my name or your name or whatever is blessed. You are called blessed, and called blessed by who? Well, by Jesus, who is also God. And it's a sense of identity, that you are blessed because God has said so. And that to me, and this is my Lutheran theology speaking, points me towards our baptismal identity and the claim that God places upon us in that you are mine. And that is an identity, and I talk about this in funeral sermons all the time, that is an identity that nothing beats. That claim that God has placed upon us, that name that God has given us, a beloved child. God has said it, and it is so, and not even death beats that. That's the promise of the gospel, and I see that same sense here, that you are known as one who is blessed. Why? Because God has said so. Even when the world doesn't acknowledge it, even when that which the world sees as blessed or as undesirable, that's not what matters. And it's what we are known as by God, what we are claimed by God. That's kind of where I'm going with this text. I got some more work to do, clearly, but those are the things that really kind of catch my attention, and I want to dwell in on is those kind of basic ideas. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, by all means, throw those down in the comment section. We can continue the conversation that way. It's good to be back with you after being off for a couple of weeks and back doing these. I hope you have a blessed week. We will catch you next time.